The security guard's flashlight swept across the parking garage at 11:47 p.m., and Maya Chen froze in the driver's seat, a thin blanket pulled up to her chin, pretending to be asleep in a car that hadn't moved from level 3 in 9 hours. He walked past. He always walked past. But tonight, for the first time in 6 weeks, someone else was still in the building above her. And that someone was about to look out a 14th floor window and see something that would stop him cold. Maya was 26 years old, and 3 months ago she had been an accountant with an apartment, a couch, and a life that made sense. Then the company she worked for collapsed overnight, her landlord raised the rent 40% the same week, and her mother's medical bills in another state ate through whatever savings she had left. She didn't tell anyone. She showered at a 24-hour gym on a guest pass she'd talked her way into. She kept a suit on a hanger in the back seat, ironed flat under a stack of books. She got the job at Coleraine Technologies 4 weeks ago, entry-level data analyst, modest salary, health insurance she hadn't used yet because she was too proud to ask anyone for help finding a place to actually live. Every morning she walked into that building looking like she had somewhere to go home to. Every night she came back down to the parking garage because the garage was free and covered and nobody asked questions. The company itself was young by industry standards, 11 years old, built from nothing by a man named Daniel Cole, who at 41 was already a name people said with a certain reverence in tech circles. He'd built Coleraine out of a 2-bedroom apartment and turned it into 14 floors of glass and ambition. He was known for 2 things, an almost obsessive attention to the small details other executives ignored, and a past he never discussed. Nobody at the company knew where Daniel Cole came from. They knew where he ended up. The gap in between was his alone, and he liked it that way. That gap began when he was 17. His father had walked out, his mother had followed 2 years later in a different, quieter way. She simply stopped being able to hold things together, and one October morning, Daniel came home from school to a padlocked door and a note taped to it that wasn't even addressed to him. He had $11, a backpack, and nowhere to be. He slept in a laundromat for 4 nights before a woman named Ruth Alvarez found him there, curled against a dryer that was still warm, and instead of calling the police, she asked him if he'd eaten. He hadn't, not in 2 days. She brought him home, not to raise him, she was careful to say, just to feed him, just for a little while. And a little while became 18 months. He slept in her garage on a cot she set up herself, insisted on paying her back in chores he never fully worked off, and she never once made him feel like a burden. She used to drive him to his after-school job in a pale blue sedan with a license plate she'd had personalized years before he ever met her. 3 letters and 2 numbers that spelled nothing in particular, but that Daniel had stared at from the passenger seat so many mornings that it burned itself into memory the way only a lifeline does. R.V.A. 27. Ruth Alvarez. She told him once, only once, that she'd never had children of her own, and that whatever the plate meant to anyone else, to her it just meant she was still here, still going somewhere. When Daniel turned 19 and got his first real paycheck, he tried to pay her back properly. She wouldn't take it. She told him the only payment she wanted was for him to do the same for somebody else someday, when he was able. He promised her he would. 6 months later, he left for a job 2 states away, wrote her letters for the first year, called less the second, and by the 3rd year, the calls had stopped altogether, the way they do when a young man gets swallowed by his own ambition and tells himself he'll reconnect once things settle down. Things never settled down. He built one company, then another, then Coleraine. He became the kind of successful that gets profiled in magazines, and when he finally tried to find her again, 7 years after he'd left, he learned she had died 2 years earlier, alone, in a small house 40 minutes from where he'd once slept in her garage. He hadn't even known she was sick. He flew out for the funeral. 9 people came. He stood in the back and said nothing, because he had no right to grief he hadn't shown up for while she was alive to receive it. He never spoke about her again, not to his board, not to his closest colleagues, not to the reporters who tried to dig up his origin story for a human interest angle. He simply carried a version of the promise he'd made her, folded up small, and let it live somewhere in the back of every decision he made about how Coleraine treated the people at the bottom of it. Better healthcare than the industry required, a strict no layoffs during earnings season policy, a personal habit of learning the names of the janitorial staff before he learned the names of his vice presidents. Nobody connected these things to a laundromat or a garage or a blue sedan. They just thought he was a decent boss. He let them think that. It was easier than the alternative. On the night everything changed, Daniel was working late, reviewing a quarterly report from a window on the 14th floor that looked directly down into the parking structure. It was nearly midnight, and he wasn't thinking about anything except numbers when he glanced up out of habit, the way you do when you've been staring at a screen too long, and his eyes caught on a car 3 levels down, parked in the same spot it had apparently occupied every night for weeks, according to the building's overnight logs, which he only later thought to check. There was a shape in the driver's seat that didn't move like someone waiting. It moved like someone sleeping, sitting up. He almost looked away. He told himself it wasn't his business, that plenty of employees stayed late, that a car in a garage at midnight meant nothing. But something about the stillness of it kept his eyes there a moment longer than they needed to be, and in that moment the garage's motion sensor lights caught the back of the car at just the right angle, and he saw the plate. RVA 27. Not vanity, not coincidence dressed up as one, because personalized plates aren't reused, they're retired when a car is sold or a person dies, and a plate combination like that doesn't simply reappear on a different car in a different city 16 years later by chance. Daniel stood at that window for almost a full minute without breathing normally, running through every rational explanation and finding none of them held. His hands were shaking slightly when he finally picked up his phone and called down to security, not to report anything, just to ask, as calmly as he could manage, who that vehicle belonged to. It took the guard 4 minutes to confirm what Daniel already suspected in the part of himself that didn't deal in coincidences. The car was registered to Maya Chen. Employee badge, level 3 access, data analytics department, hired 6 weeks ago. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat with his laptop open to her HR file, not digging for anything invasive, just looking at a name and a face and trying to understand how the universe had decided to hand him back, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, a debt he'd spent 16 years failing to repay. He didn't confront her the next morning. He wasn't even sure yet what he'd say, and he was terrified of getting it wrong, of turning a woman's quiet dignity into a spectacle, of making her feel exposed in front of people she worked beside every day. So he did the only thing that felt right. He asked HR to quietly pull the employment file of the car's previous registration history, which took 2 days and a favor, and what came back confirmed it in a way that left no room for doubt. The car had been registered to Ruth Alvarez until her death. It had passed, through an estate with almost nothing else in it, to her only listed next of kin, a granddaughter she had raised on and off during summers, a granddaughter named Maya, who had inherited a 14-year-old sedan and almost nothing else, because Ruth Alvarez had spent whatever she had on other people her whole life, including, once, a runaway boy in a laundromat. Daniel finally approached Maya on a Thursday afternoon, not in his office, where the power difference would sit in the room like a wall, but in the small break room on the 3rd floor, where he made a point of getting himself a coffee he didn't particularly want, just to have a reason to be there when she came in. He didn't lead with the plate. He asked her gently how she was settling in, whether the job suited her, ordinary things. Then he asked, as casually as he could, where she'd grown up, and when she mentioned a grandmother who'd basically raised her every summer, a grandmother named Ruth who used to say the strangest things about strangers and second chances, Daniel had to set his coffee down because his hand wasn't steady enough to hold it. He told her then, standing in a break room that smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner, about a laundromat and a warm dryer, and 18 months in a garage, and a promise he'd made a woman he loved like family and had failed, in the end, to keep in time. Maya cried before he finished the story, not because she was embarrassed to be found out about the car, she'd stopped having room for that kind of pride weeks ago, but because for the first time since her grandmother died, someone was telling her a story about Ruth Alvarez that Maya hadn't already heard, and it meant her grandmother's kindness had traveled further than Maya ever knew, all the way into the life of the man who now, impossibly, signed her paychecks. What Daniel did next, he did carefully, and privately, and without a single press release. He didn't hand her a check in front of the office or make her story into a marketing moment, because he understood, better than most people in his position ever bother to, that being someone's charity case in public can cost a person more dignity than sleeping in a car ever did. Instead, he quietly arranged, through HR and not through his own name, a relocation stipend that existed on paper as part of a hardship transition fund available to any employee, a fund that, as it happened, hadn't existed the week before and would exist for every employee at Coleraine going forward. He covered her mother's outstanding medical balance through a foundation he set up that same month in a name that wasn't his own. He didn't offer Maya a promotion she hadn't earned. He offered her, instead, the one thing that mattered more: a manager who finally knew, without her having to say it, that a person can be brilliant at their job and still be quietly drowning, and that the two aren't a contradiction, they're just a life. 6 months later, Maya had her own apartment, current on rent, with a couch she'd bought herself and was inordinately proud of. She still drove the same blue sedan. She never sold it, not because she needed reminding of what it had cost her, but because she'd come to understand, the way her grandmother always seemed to understand things before anyone explained them, that some objects carry people forward long after the people themselves are gone. Daniel kept his distance the way he had to, careful never to let their history become a workplace dynamic that made her uncomfortable, but every year on the anniversary of Ruth's death, an anonymous donation went out in her name to a shelter 3 states away, to a program that helped people sleeping in cars find their way to something steadier. Nobody at Coleraine ever connected the donation to their CEO. Maya did, eventually, but she never told anyone either. Some debts, she came to understand, aren't meant to be settled loudly. They're meant to be carried forward, quietly, into somebody else's second chance. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this: the people who help us without asking for anything back rarely know how far that kindness travels, or how long it waits, sometimes 16 years, sometimes longer, before it finds its way back into the world through someone else's hands. If you believe kindness has a way of coming full circle, even when we've stopped expecting it to, stay with us. There's another story waiting, and I think you'll want to hear it too.